what we're going to be covering today is taking your models that you've created out of Gravity Sketch and bringing them into the Substance Suite. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Substance Suite, it's a suite of tools from Adobe. So the kind of core of it is to create your own materials, apply them onto your models, and then render them out in the tools that Adobe has or in any other suites. So the tools from Substance, they support a whole range of 3D programs. So you can bring these tools and these materials that you create and the models that you render out into programs like Keyshot, Unreal, Blender. The plugins and the materials that we're going to create today are agnostic. So you can kind of bring them into any 3D program that you might be using. So we're going to kind of kick it off because I'm going to talk about three of the programs today. So it's going to be a pretty fast presentation. We'll have a Q&A at the end, but I'm going to go at a pretty fast clip. So I'm happy to repeat things at the later on in the presentation. For the Substance Suite, as I was mentioning, there's a range of programs. So the programs that we have, Painter, you can kind of think of that as Photoshop for 3D models. So everything that you can do in Photoshop, you can do in Painter. Stager is like a quick visualization rendering tool for creating quick 3D scenes and taking photographs of that. Modeler is a desktop and VR clay sculpting tool. Sampler lets you create materials from scratch using existing photographs or photographs you take or kind of other filters and tools available to you. And Designer is like this super powerful parametric tool that you can create materials down to the individual thread level if you would like. What we're going to be talking about today is Sampler, Painter, and Stager. And we'll do a little bit of quick overview of the three programs, how they can work in unison with one another. Now you can take the projects you create in one app and transfer it over to the others. So if you're working out of Gravity Sketch, some of the best practices to recommend is when you're finished with your project, save your project out as an FBX, have your normal set to welded, and then mesh is the better format instead of NURBS when you're exporting out of Gravity Sketch. The other thing to note is that depending on how you color up your model, I think Jose actually had a great presentation on this. The color grouping will dictate different layer groups. So if you wanted to kind of isolate and say like, hey, I'm working on all of these parts of my project are all going to be rubber, or all these parts are going to be a fabric, separate those out to their individual color channels. And then when you bring them into Painter, they'll all be separated out. So you can just drag and drop materials right onto those pieces. So we're going to go work in the substance. You already have a model ready to go. So in Painter, it's not exactly a one-on-one, it's kind of like a little overview. So I'm not going to go through every single setting that we have available to us. But I've had this seat that I created previously, and I'm going to bring it into Painter itself. In terms of UV unwrapping, Painter does have auto UV unwrapping. So if you're kind of struggling with UV, so it's a kind of trouble spot for you, you can absolutely bring your models from Gravity Sketch in and then have Painter unwrap those UVs for you. But what makes Painter unique is if we just left click and we click on the model itself, is that we can paint directly onto the model. So all the tools that we've associated with Photoshop, as mentioning, we can absolutely use in the program. So we even have the ability, if we type in Photoshop down here, you can kind of see that we have all the Photoshop brushes. So if you kind of come from the Photoshop world, a lot of this is going to be familiar to you. So in terms of painting, we can change everything about a material. So we can change the color of it. We can change the how metallic it is, how glossy, how shiny, the height, the bump. We can have full control over all those properties in this program. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of create a car interior for us. So let's say we have a deadline coming up and we have to model or render out a car interior in about like 30 minutes, kind of like this presentation here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at my asset libraries that I have down here. So in Painter, on the left-hand side, we have our toolbars. We have layers that you might be familiar with if you're kind of coming from the Adobe ecosystem. And then down here is our library. So let's say I'm going through and I want to apply a material or fabric to this. I can search for fabrics down here in the material toolbar down here. And I can drag and drop any of these materials and apply them onto my seat here. When it does that, it's going to apply based off UV map, so you can see the projection mode and how it's being applied down here in the properties. But what makes Substance special is that everything is parametric. So if we find a material and we're like, all right, this fabric is cool, but I don't like this green kind of like muddy brown color. Every property of a material is changeable. So you can go through and you can make any alterations to a material and nothing is lost. So if you go through and you're saying like, okay, cool, like this colorway is great, but now my boss is telling me like I need to do a blue colorway, you can go right back into the settings here and just make a quick change to that material without having to like re-search for material or edit it in another application. All of the parameters for these materials are available to you down here. What's nice too is that if you're familiar with working with masks, for instance, you can apply a mask because maybe you don't need like fabric over this entire car seat. You can apply a mask, and just like you would have in Photoshop, if you're familiar with working with masks, you can paint in the areas of the model where you want that material to be revealed. And this is super nice, but you can kind of imagine like, okay, cool, I'm painting this in, but it's going to take a ton of time to like actually apply this fabric across this one piece. As I was mentioning before, you have the ability to unwrap. So I already had this asset kind of unwrapped previously. But instead of going through and trying to paint out the mask where I want this material to show up, I can go through and take advantage of the fact that I have my UV maps and select the components of my seat where I want the fabric to appear. And when I take a look at it back, the fabric or the zones based off that UV have that material applied to it. And again, as I was saying, it's parametric. So if I go back here and I'm like, all right, this blue colorway is great, but my boss is telling me like, now I want to do like a yellow colorway. I can go back and change those material properties without having to redo the mask or redo any of that work. It's all just kind of saved into that layer stack itself. So I'm going to go through and let's say we have this fabric on here, but now I want to apply like a leather here, like maybe like a Napa leather. So if I try to search for Napa leather, I don't really have anything in my library here. But what you do have access to, side over here, is Substance also has a whole host of materials that you can download. So you're not stuck with that one material library that I was showing you before. If you go to the Substance 3D assets, and people can hop onto this like no problem if you just Google search that, we have 12,000 materials, and they add a couple hundred like each month. So it scales like tremendously. In the materials, though, we can go and click on these surfaces here, and you can search for different fabrics, different leathers, marbles, metals, kind of like there's a whole range of materials you can look for. But what's nice is that, let's say I want a Napa leather for my car seat. If I search for Napa leather, I'll get a list of leathers that pop up. And if I click on any one of these leathers here, I can click on the web player, and I can see what parameters I can change on those materials. So if you're looking for something like I found this material, but it's like 80% of the way there, it's not quite right. What I'd recommend is opening up that web player, taking a look at what alterations you can change, because we can change like the roughness. We can change, maybe there's like a metallic finish onto this leather itself, the height, the perforations, the color, even the patterning here down here. It looks like so each material is unique. So it's kind of leaves you a lot of room to explore and experiment and kind of see what material you can create. And that's all. You can just hop onto the website and try that out. But what's nice is that, let's say I don't want to, I can go ahead, I can download that material from the website. But if I want to do it faster in the Creative Cloud app on my desktop, I can search for materials. So I can search for Napa leather. And instead of trying to download and drag and drop it in, which is, you can absolutely just drag and drop it in, all of the materials here, I can click on this little button and I can send this material directly into the application itself. So maybe I want this Napa leather, but also I want this like chevron pattern, maybe as like a little decorative piece here. So I can click on those buttons here. And now when I go into my app and search for Napa, those materials, oops, I think it's installed the other one too. Those materials will appear down here. So instead of having to go through and trying to like search and drag and drop, I can just click send to, and then I can just apply it right onto my model down here. And again, it works just like Photoshop in terms of layer stack. So if I drop that leather beneath the fabric, then I can make those alterations down here. And that yellow is a little intense, so I'm going to go and just change that yellow. Let's keep it really simple to black and white car seat today. Cool. So I can change this leather. I can make all those alterations. I can change the tiling size. And as we kind of increase that tiling size, we zoom in there, we can kind of see the results that we're getting. Pretty nice there. But let's say you're going through the website, you're trying to find material and you just can't find it, or maybe you have material that you've found or created yourself in real life and you want to make it yourself. I'm going to go into another application, Sampler, very quickly. And I'm going to mention like how we can create materials from scratch. So one thing Sampler lets you do is you can take any photograph and turn it into a 3D material. So Sampler is the kind of material creation program I was mentioning. But if you want to create a material from scratch, all we're going to do is find a photograph that we have on our desktop. We'll drag and drop it into the program. And by default, we have this image to material selected. So if we hit import down here, and we'll give it about like 30 to 45 seconds. It uses a kind of like AI tool in the background to reference that photograph and create a 3D material out of it. So there's a couple faults here because again, like it's not the best photograph. It's recommend like top down, like even lighting. But I wanted to show like a worst case scenario here. So we have this material, it's like this nice woven, but it's it's off angle. We have some faults with it. We can fix that in this program here. So one thing we can do is we can go ahead and we can crop out part of this photograph. So instead of getting all this kind of like area outside of that material, we can crop that in. And as we crop it in, you can see live what's happening to that material. So it's a good way to kind of give you a sense check of what's happening to your material here. So we'll crop this out, but we can also see that it's off axis, like it's kind of skewed. So if we search for perspective transform, I can grab this material and I can straighten it out. So hopefully it will tile a little bit better after I straighten this out here. And we can see like as I'm straightening this out, we're getting much better tiling results. Again, not perfect, but there's other tools within the program. And the last thing we can kind of see like some of these arcs here are just kind of like just off, like we're getting it a lot more even, looks a lot better, but we can also warp this as well. So again, some of the things you might be familiar with in Photoshop, like warping, transforming, all those tools are available to you here. You can use that to fix your tiling. So if you ever try to tile materials or try to create materials in other applications and you have to like go back into Photoshop and try to warp it and tile it so it looks perfectly aligned, this program Sampler here lets you do all that work and validate it within the application itself without having to go back and forth between like Photoshop and trying to bring it in and seeing if it actually works right. So a couple other tools. I'm just going to recolor this because I don't want, it's a little bit, there's some variations with the color. So I'm just going to use a color replace here. And I'm just going to crank all the values up just so it can replace everything here with a single color tone. Let's do like a nice soft white there. And in case of little tiny issues here, where I can see some seams, there's one more layer here for make a tile. So I can force it to tile and I can kind of dictate like where I want that transition to happen. So it just helps with any of those little tiny imperfections. So within probably, what was that, about 3 or 4 minutes, going from just a really bad photograph into a 3D material, we can always clean this up. Like there's other tools in the program to like make those fine-tune adjustments. But like I'm on a timetable here, so let's kind of maybe we're happy with this, maybe we're ready to present this to our boss. So now we're ready to apply it to our seat that we had. In Sampler here, before I send this up, I'm going to double click on that material. I'm going to rename it. So we'll call this GS Around Demo. In Sampler and any of the other Substance Suite tools, there's an option in the interface to send the assets we create into another program. So I can take this material exactly as we see here and send it directly into Painter. So when I go back into Painter, and to the main search filter, give it about, takes about like a minute for it to process through. But that material that I created in Sampler will pop up here in Painter. And it needs to compile, it needs to kind of save it down. So it takes a little bit of time, but there it is here. So that material that we created in Sampler here is now ready for us to use here in Painter. And again, that material that we created, that came from a photograph. So there's nothing existing before. That was just like a really bad photograph of my car seat that I took. But I wanted to show that even if you have like not the most ideal photograph, you can still make a really nice material out of something. So I can take the mask that I created earlier, I can paste it into this material, and all that work that I did before is now being replicated here in my car seat. So we have this nice kind of woven fabric material. Maybe I want to change that tiling down a little bit more just so it kind of looks a little bit cleaner there. And now I'm going to go through and work on the rest of my seat here. So I have the leather here, but currently the leather is being applied to everywhere across the car seat itself. And just for color variation, I'm just going to change that to a black leather there. And I'm going to make a mask. Same process as before. I'm going to use that UV selection tool here to select the components of my car seat where I want the leather to appear at. And let's get into some of the details. So let's say I wanted to add that chevron Napa leather in. So I have that Napa chevron material that I grabbed in. I can apply that onto my form here. And with the chevron, again, I want that chevron pattern to repeat. So if I take a look and I scale it down and kind of see this nice, and with the lighting there, there you go. And let me focus on 3D viewport so you can see it a little more clearly. We can see this nice chevron pattern tiling and repeating here. But one thing I want to do is I want to have it only in specific areas. So with 3D materials, if you're kind of getting into 3D in the first place, there's different properties that make up a material. So there's color, there's height, which kind of is like how much it kind of extrudes off the surface. Normals is how like it interacts with light. Roughness is how glossy or shiny or matte it is, and metallic is kind of what gives metallic materials their own unique properties. So say I want the chevron pattern right here, but I want to make sure I color match. So I have the other Napa leathers color correctly. I can turn off the color channel so I know that I'm not taking into color data. And I can turn off the roughness value as well. So I can make sure I have the same amount of gloss or shine as that other material that I had. So I can kind of use that to kind of make sure that the two Napa leathers are close to one. I can add in a mask. And this time I actually want to paint it out because I only want it to be, maybe I want the chevron only in this particular area of the car seat. But again, if I try to paint this out, it looks great, but I want to make sure it's mirrored. I want to make sure it's perfect. There is mirror tools in the application, so I can mirror out this model. And I'm actually going to be using a Wacom pen here. So I can use that Wacom pen and paint out exactly where I want that chevron pattern to appear. Oops, I'm touching that by accident. And so it's perfectly aligned there. The other thing that maybe I want to do is add some stitches because trying to model stitches is a major challenge. And even in Jose's demo, I think when I was a guest speaker there, I was kind of alluding to that you could paint stitches here in the application. So let's say you wanted to actually paint the stitches in. You create a new paintbrush layer. There are stitch brushes in the application itself. And the stitch brushes are dynamic, so they'll kind of follow the direction of your paintbrush itself. So if I click and I start to paint on my model here, and I zoom in, we can see the stitches are being created. And let's increase the size there to about 4 so we can see it a little bit clearer. But I can paint the stitches in, and then if I take a look, it's actually going to be affecting the channels I have dictated here. So I have the normal, I have the height turned on. Height's a little aggressive here. But you can see it's actually starting to deform the surface of my model here and actually give me these nice kind of really realistic stitches. Again, all by just painting it in. We don't need to try to model that in because again, trying to model that by hand would be very, very tedious. So I can go through, I can kind of find where maybe I want like stitches alongside of my seat here. I can paint all the stitches and effects in throughout my car seat. And maybe add some right here in that seam there. And the stitches as well. So let's say I want like a different type of stitch up here. Maybe I don't want this like kind of X cross pattern. If we scroll down the stitches here, we can change the stitch type. So we can do diagonal stitches. There's a whole other stitching brushes to do like double-sided or single-sided stitches. So if we just want like a simple single stitch line, there's a whole host of different stitch brushes in the application that we could take advantage of. but I'll kind of keep a simple stitch there, maybe some cross stitches for the rest of the body. And pretty much in a couple minutes here, we're actually able to get like a nice representation of this car seat. The last couple of things, maybe I want some like nice plastic or a metal here for like the little framing, setup that we have for the car. So I can go back into those materials. I can drag and drop a metal down here, and I can always drag that down beneath my layer stack so it appears only in the areas that are unpainted. I can click on that material. Again, everything's parametric, so I can go into the color channels here, change the color. I can save swatches too. So there's a color palette I really like, I can save my own color palette and swatches down here. And within a little bit of time, we're actually, have a pretty nice result here. So I could, go in, I can spend a ton more time adding in detail. I can kind of bring in graphics and patterns. I'm not saying actually, maybe that's a good point. Maybe we wanted to have like a nice kind of graphic or effect here. And maybe we wanted to have it as an emboss. You don't want it to like actually paint onto the surface itself. In the program, we can apply graphics across our asset here. So I have a nice kind of cool graphic that I want to apply to my asset here. But what's unique is because I know how these materials work, I can actually tell the program like, hey, I don't want to take the color information or like the glossiness or like the metallic information of that. I want it to affect the height so that it looks like it's actually embossing on the surface here. So if I crank up the height channel, there you go. So if I crank up that height channel, now I can tell the program to have my graphic drive this, I can have my graphic drive the height information. So if I wanted to have like a cool, graphic kind of as an emboss or a deboss, I can actually do that, be taking advantage of how these 3D materials work. And if I only wanted to show up in specific areas, I can always control my masks here and kind of paint out specific zones where I only want these materials to blend together. Then here, let me paintbrush here. Start with that. So I can kind of paint in and maybe say like I only want this graphic to kind of show up in a specific zone, if that's the case. So you can kind of do some very interesting effects. If you come from the footwear industry as well, having these graphics and applying them to your outsole will save you a ton of time because you can extrude these graphics off the surface and this height information off the surface. So for instance, if you were to, let's say, crank up the displacement for this, kind of subdivision count a little bit, and we look at the graphic that I applied here, it's coming off the surface because it's taking that height and displacement information and kind of extruding that effect off of the model itself. What's nice though is that you can export this out and save this geometry with the displacement intact. So if you wanted to 3D print this, you can, and it will save all that information for you. So if you wanted to do some high frequency texture work onto your model, but you don't want to try to model it in because it's going to take a ton of time, you can basically, it's a hard concept to grasp, but you can paint, you can model by painting, if that makes sense. So a little bit of advanced concept. We'll kind of save that for a different demo for another day. And we'll just kind of leave the model as it is because it looks pretty nice here and I don't want to overcomplicate things. And we have one more application to talk about. So I have my car seat, looks pretty nice. And now I want to bring this in and do a nice clean render out of this. So in Painter, on the left-hand side here is that same button that we had in Sampler, and we can send this model directly into an application called Stager, which is a 3D rendering application. And so give it a moment or two for it to load up. But in Stager, we can kind of see our car seat here is ready to go. And it works off of a ray tracing method. So we can kind of turn ray tracing on and we can see all that texture work and all those materials that we've created on our model and like really nice detail here. And this is just like giving you a preview mode. So like the full rendering capabilities, we switch to render mode and get like the one-to-one representation, but ray tracing is going to give me a nice, good, accurate idea of what's happening to that model. So as maybe you don't want to spend too much time kind of going through every single tool and every single program. So I have a car interior that I've kind of created previously. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. So let's say I had this entire car interior. I have all these pieces, and I want to bring it into like a final render here. So I have this car interior. I'm going to move the seat into position. So kind of rotate that a little bit off axis. So let's grab that rotation and just snap it the other way. There we go. And we're going to make sure it's kind of placed roughly in that front driver's seat here. What's nice too is you can see, like, as I move this model around, like there's like that teal blue line. Stager has collision detection, so it kind of snap things together, so you're not clipping through the geometry unless you wanted to. But the collision detection is nice because I can, get it roughly where I want, and it's going to say like, hey, you're about to touch something else in your model. Like that might be where you want to kind of leave that if you want things to kind of evenly sit next to each other. But I have my car seat and I have it in my interior. And I have ray tracing on, and that's nice, but now I need to make all my lights. Now I need to do this, and we're on a time crunch here. So instead of trying to create lights, which we absolutely can do, there's a full like lighting suite here. In the Substance Asset site, there's not just materials, but we also have 3D models. So you can kind of grab other 3D models and other assets, and we can bring those into Stager so you can kind of create an entire scene if we wanted to. But we also have environmental lights. So these are a mix of HDRI maps, backplates, and 3D cameras. So these environmental lights here, you can bring them into Stager and then use the HDRI maps, the backplates, all that to kind of drive your lighting solution in your final render. So I have the hard light out of the warehouse hard light scene already downloaded on my computer here. And if I want to bring that into Stager, I have this .usda file, and if I drag and drop that into Stager and give it a couple seconds for it to load, it will take all those HRIs, those 3D cameras, and add it into my scene here in the program. I might have ray tracing turned on, so I might be kind of thinking a little bit too hard there, so I'll turn ray tracing off for just a moment. But we can see that we have this backplate, we have our HDRIs, we have a ton of cameras here, and we have our car. It's just out of view. But we can grab the car and the car seat, move that into position of where my camera would be. It's a little too close still, so let's move that back just a bit more. And if we rotate that into position, kind of pull it a bit closer to camera, and throw ray tracing on, we get a nice representation of what our final product could be. So it's kind of with the suite of apps. I know it kind of went by very quick, but I wanted to leave some time for the Q&A available for everybody. But wanted to showcase that, hey, even if you have like a very short amount of time and like you're on a crunch and like the expectations are really high for you, you can make beautiful, really interesting work with the programs. And there's stuff in the tools that I haven't even mentioned, because we can add like stuff like wear and tear, we can add dirt, we can add grime, and it will accumulate naturally in the areas that you'd expect it to on your 3D models. So for instance, if you have like if you're doing like a video game, you have an artifact and it's like pulling out of the ground, there's tools in Painter to generate out dirt and materials in the crevices of your model. So you don't have to even spend time thinking about where you want to have that done. The program will do that for you. So it will save a ton of time for you. So, wanted to kind of give a quick overview. Again, like there's a lot more that I could talk about. I've done these demos for my classes, and usually like a 14-week class to cover like 4 of the programs. So I wanted to leave it open as a Q&A. Can help answer any questions in the last like 10, 15 minutes we have here. But hopefully everybody was able to keep up with this like speed run of the Substance Suite. If Daniela is there.
Hey, Nick. Thank you for that. I think it was really, really useful for a lot of people. There were some tears in the audience. I can read some of the messages. Good tears.
Yeah, it's I've been using Substance since like actually picked up pretty much at the same time I got into Gravity Sketch. I got Gravity Sketch like 2017. So I picked up both programs around the same time. And so all this comes with a lot of time. and I do teaching and demos, so it's like ingrained in my head. But what I have to say is, like, even if you have like a 2D background, or if you have you're new to 3D, if you know Photoshop, if you know Illustrator, a lot of the same workflows are going to be the exact same thing that you see here. So it's not as big of a gap as you'd imagine it to be.
Yeah, we've heard that a lot from like Substance users. It's like
Mhm.
just pretty straightforward. Don't
Yeah.
be scared. All right, I'll read some questions from the audience. Can you export CMF slash displacement, etc., to be read for 2D renderings and VR review?
Yes. So not only can if depending on how you have your file set up, you can export out. You can kind of see these UV maps. So if you have like a good workflow, or not a good workflow, but something I do in product design is for apparel specifically, you have your flat patterns. And so your flats for apparel, like where you'd stitch and seam those together, are going to be similar to UVs. So you can export those out, and then you can have that set and ready to go for review. So there's a lot of uh, interchangeability between the apps, and all the Substance materials, they have a metadata tag. So if you want to have something specific associated with that material, you can save that metadata information out. So maybe it's like a specific vendor you're working with, or some unique information about that material. You can save that.
Awesome. Um, what does it use to render? CPU, graphics card? I'm working on a 2015 iMac. Also, is there a cloud rendering service available or in plan for folks who don't have a powerful machine?
Yeah. So there's both CPU and GPU rendering. So Painter here has a CPU renderer. In Stager, if I switch over to this ray tracing button, Stager has a more robust rendering solution, and you're going to get much more accurate materials out of it. But you can render in GPU mode or CPU mode. So with that button there, we can kind of see the difference. I have a fairly fast GPU in here, so when I switch GPU rendering on, it's pretty much instantaneously. Like, I'll get the nice clean results, and if I move this around, GPU rendering, it's pretty much solved and cleaned up. Whoops. Immediately. But yeah, you have the ability to do both. In terms of cloud rendering, there's no cloud rendering service with the Substance Suite at the moment.
So you don't have to UV unwrap your model in Blender anymore?
No, so you can. So there's, if you want to do quick alterations, there is that automatic UV unwrapping tool. So the one thing I'll recommend, well, not recommend, but I'll kind of give like a heads up for, is it's still not like handcrafted. So the AI unwrapping will do its best to kind of look like natural divots and seams. Like maybe you have like a crevice in your model. It'll try to find those and create the UV maps along those paths. But sometimes, like, you maybe have like a super like solid or rounded surface, and it can't find a crevice, it can't find a crack, can't find something that it create a UV map, seam in. So you might have these weird splits, like where you don't want them to. So there are some cases where you still have to go into programs to get like a perfect UV map, but there's workflows like you can use a triplanar projection to kind of hide where the seams would be in your models if you have like one bad seam.
What format would you export the car seat in order to bring it back into Gravity Sketch?
Yes, you can. Out of these programs, you can export out the model and the material separately. But FBX is great. So in my workflow from Gravity Sketch, like, I'll save everything out as an FBX, and I'll bring everything back in as an FBX for myself.
Can you please do a recap of what each of the Substance programs do? Like 3D Sampler is for making materials, etc.
Yeah. So Sampler here is for making materials and making alterations to materials. So for instance, I can bring in a photograph and kind of drag and drop it in. One thing I haven't talked today, it's a little bit harder to show here, is that there's new photogrammetry tools. So if you wanted to make a 3D model out of just something in your life, so let's say have this coffee cup here, you can take like, a bunch of photographs of it, bring those photographs into Sampler, and it'll make this into a 3D model. So that's like a newer kind of program or new kind of application within Sampler, but it's really great for like taking photographs and turning it into something. Painter, Photoshop for 3D models, kind of best way to describe it. It's spent most time in Painter today. Stager is for like those quick rendering solution. So it's not the most robust rendering program, but if you just want to make something really quickly, you're like on a time crunch, you want to make something beautiful, Sage is a great solution for that. The other two that we haven't talked about today, they're a little bit harder to demo, in a shorter time frame. But Designer is like a parametric node-based material creation solution. So if you're familiar with Houdini or Grasshopper, like it's kind of familiar to those. So it's a very, very powerful program, but it can be intimidating to show in a demo. So I kind of hid that one away. But it's great if you like, I want the perfect material and I want all the control over it. You can get down into those little nitty-gritty details to create something bespoke. And then Model is the newest program. So it's like a clay modeling suite of tools, or a clay modeling program. So it works on a voxel base. So it's different than Gravity Sketch. Like there's things in Gravity Sketch, like if I do footwear models or automotive, I stick to Gravity Sketch myself. But if you want to do like really organic stuff like creatures or monsters, that kind of thing, because it works on a voxel based system, you can kind of get into the volumetrics of those. So if you wanted to kind of make more organic stuff, it's a good tool. It works in both desktop and VR.
Please, can you show a 3D exported file while all these details from Substance 3D to 3D print?
I have one right here. So here's something that's here. Let me. I wonder if I stop the presenting if it shows up a little bit.
Yeah, you're bigger now.
Yeah. So actually, this is something I did. So back in 2018, I was doing a workshop with Timberland, and so we were experimenting with like Houdini and Gravity Sketch, and so there's a concept I did, and I'll pull it up. I have a render of it, but when I made that, I kind of made this like artistic, representation of a last. But it was, I was like, there's no way I can 3D print it. And so there's a company called Stratasys, and they had these kind of like 3D printed in resin forms that they did for Lady Gaga that I saw at the San Francisco MoMA. So I was like, okay, now we can actually print this. So the model itself, I remade it. And then I created all the painting, the kind of like tiger stripes and the color gradients and Painter. And then I sent them the Painter file, and they were able to print this out in clear resin. So, I mean, this is like a crazy use case of like something probably far beyond what you're expecting, but just it shows like, hey, like if you have like a very crazy or hard concept that you want to 3D print, like you can absolutely 3D print it.
That's beautiful. Are the tools to help you bring in your own materials, and are these programs sold as a package or a standalone?
Yeah, so there's two different packages. There's one with, I'll need to double check this, but I believe it's Painter, Sampler, and Designer packaged together. And there's one with the entire suite. Both of those, you can get access to all the materials. So I think there's like different like limits and caps for the material set. But if you're a student, you have access to all of the programs for free. So on the site, it's a little bit buried. You have to kind of go down to the footnote. But if you're a student, you can go to like, I think I'll search for it and I can kind of add it to the chat at some point. But you sign up as a student, you get all the programs for free. There's some restrictions on the material library itself, but you can explore to your heart's content there. What was the first part of that question?
Are there tools to help you bring in your own materials?
Yeah. So the one I was kind of showing over here. Share my screen again. So the other program I was showing here, Sampler. So you can, depending on where you're getting your materials from. So if you download them from online, if you work with other material libraries, you can still bring all those materials into the program. Like it's totally fine, and you can work with that. What's nice about Sampler, and I didn't really get too much of a chance to showcase it, but let's say you have a material that you found online, or a material that you grabbed from scratch, and you want to have the ability to make it parametric. So you want the ability to change things over time. So maybe I wanted to add in like perforations and patterns into this material. In Sampler, if you find anything, like maybe I want to change the hole size because I don't know exactly like how big or like kind of tight the holes I want to make are, you can click on this little pin icon, and it's called exposing the parameter. So when you bring this material into Painter, you can make those adjustments in the program later on. So you can bring material libraries from anywhere, bring them in Sampler, like set it up so you can change all the properties of that material and then use it in whatever you want. You know, not just Substance. You can Unreal, Blender, all that. You can bring them into.
Can you export the models with materials directly to Unreal and Sketchfab, etc.?
Yeah, so each suite or each kind of program has like a different plugin. So Unreal, I believe UE5 has a beta plugin. It's not fully out yet, but if you're on a 4.27, I believe, like there's a Substance plugin, so you can bring in the entire Substance asset with all the materials. Sketchfab, I'm not exactly sure what that plugin system looks like, but for Keyshot, for instance, there's like in Keyshot, it's a little interesting. So you bring the model in, and there's a little drop domain at the very top of Keyshot, so you can bring in like the packaged material library, and then you open that up, and it just applies it right into your model in Keyshot. So if you're happy with rendering in Keyshot, you can absolutely bring all the painted assets directly into Keyshot itself. So each program is unique.
You mentioned importing and exporting FBX. What about other formats?
Yeah, so the new, or like not the new, but the main format that Substance is kind of aiming towards is USD formats. So OBJs, FBXs, like those are kind of like the bread and butter of it. USD is going to be one of the new standards for the Substance suite overall. And that's just for like the geometry and packaging in your materials as well.
I work with a lot of translucent, transparent, iridescent textures. I'm wondering if that is a type of material that can be produced.
Yes. So there are a couple of kind of like what I call like challenging materials. So translucents, like there absolutely are. So we just search for library to just for glass, right? There's a bunch of different glasses here. There's chromatic materials, there's iridescent, but stuff like chromatic, iridescent, translucent materials, those also tie heavily into the rendering solution that you have. So, for instance, I have to my favorite program that I like to use is I like Cinema 4D and Redshift as like my rendering kind of animation solution. So when I bring my models from Painter into Cinema, they're ready to go. I have all my materials on it. It's great, but I have to go into the node network for how Redshift kind of handles translucent materials, make some alterations so I can get the actual proper translucency. So those are some of the little more challenging effects, and that depends on the rendering program at the end of the day.